Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We would like to present and discuss on a book of Thinking Fast and Slow, written by Kahneman. So this book is basically meant to help the public understand the scientific and statistical topics. So the writer's desire in writing this book is to help people who do not have experience in cognitive science and psychology understand the way their minds work, their intuitions, their biases, their decision-making processes, and ultimately how they evaluate their own experiences. So the writer's goals are to help people identify when they are prone to make mistakes, how those mistakes have real-life consequences, and even how societies and governments can influence public policy to help people avoid those mistakes.
In addition, the author provides useful tools of communication with which individuals may use to enhance their ability to detect these inaccuracies. The author found that it is highly likely to have an impact on the inability to recognize mistakes in understanding. Thus, he recommends a diagnosis that, if well handled, will go a long way to allowing individuals to make rational decisions.
Okay, so in the book, there is mention about intuition, deliberation, and laziness. So basically, the writer introduces readers with two ways of people thinking, which he calls System 1 and System 2. So basically, this is a part in our brain. Okay, so System 1 handles involuntary automatic processing and is often associated with intuitions. And people's intuitions are often right, but in certain circumstances, System 1 makes key judgmental errors or is easily manipulated, as in System 1, it requires less effort with processing things extremely quick and automatically. So thinking fast takes a little energy, unlike thinking slow. For example, people will naturally stop walking if they are asked to complete a difficult mental task. And because of this, people will naturally tend towards allowing System 1 to take over. Okay. In contrast, System 2 is used in scenarios that require more deliberate effort, such as in calculations. And while System 2 can be more accurate than System 1, it too can sometimes be fooled by simple manipulations, because the human brain tries to use the least amount of energy possible when confronted with something that cannot be calculated or solved automatically. So the writer argues that the brain is lazy by nature, and people should work to recognize situations in which mistakes or manipulations are likely and attempt to avoid those missteps. So System 2 also makes people prone to simplify the complicated questions in order to work less hard. So basically, another way that System 2 tries to simplify its thought process is by using any available information as a guide, even though the information may not actually be useful. So, what I can conclude is that fast thinking can sometimes lead to judgments that don't make sense in comparison to other responses. So the goal then is to broaden the context in which people make decisions, and System 1 is also easily manipulated by outside factors. For example, the writer described this as priming, so people's automatic associations that can change their behavior and actions in ways that they do not realize. They do not intentionally choose to be less altruistic, but their System 1 makes that choice for them. So primes can be found in many places, but the writer's point is to ensure that people are not intentionally manipulated. So in the end, System 1 and System 2 are both modes of thinking that help people answer questions and make assumptions. So in this book, the writers demonstrates that people cannot always rely on their automatic responses, but also that even when people put in extra effort, they are prone to errors because they rely on faulty reasoning. So the goal then is to recognize those methods of faulty reasoning, which the writer refers it to heuristics, and attempt to avoid them in order to be more rational and accurate thinkers.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Hazirah, and I will continue with human fallibility and overconfidence. After introducing the two modes of thinking called System 1 and System 2, Kahneman highlights some of the underlying fallacies people rely on as they process information. People tend to be overconfident in their abilities to correctly answer questions, and make calculations. However, this overconfidence leads not only to biased conclusions based on a person's subjective experiences, but often leads to outright error. In order to make their life easier, people tend to follow their thoughts and make a guess when answering questions. They are often ignore relevant outside data. This makes them extremely confident in their answers, but only because they have simplified their mental processes. People look for evidence that confirms a belief they already hold rather than looking for evidence that disproves it. For example, if people are asked about Sam, is Sam friendly? They look for evidence to confirm that Sam is in fact friendly rather than find examples that disprove it. Therefore, they are biased to agree with the question. Kahneman uses a principle, what you see is all there is, to explain how people only use information presented to them in their consideration of facts and calculations. This also makes them overconfident in their predictive abilities. For example, when Kahneman worked in the Israeli army, he evaluated soldiers for officer training by watching a team building exercise for a few hours. He would then make predictions about who might be the best candidate for the training. Ultimately, his predictions were only slightly better than blind guesses. He only used what he was able to see, assumed that a few hours would be representative of soldiers' performance more generally, and had great confidence in his ability to predict. People also tend to put so much confidence in what they know from their own experiences and ignore any other potential outside data because they inherently feel more secure in their own knowledge and experience than those of others.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. I am Sakinah. I will tell about the summarize of this theme. Kahneman showed that humans are natural storytellers. They try to make sense of the world by attaching stories to the event that occur. Because of this, Kahneman explained that humans have a difficult time reckoning with purely statistical or numerical information, and they underestimate the randomness of the world. One of the biggest difficulties that people face in making decisions or analyzing data when they presented in statistical information in conjunction with a narrative principle. Even though the statistical information hold as much weight, if not more than the narrative, people generally prefer the narrative.
In another example, Kahneman describes a scenario: a cab was involved in a hit-and-run accident at night. 85% of the cabs in the city are green and 15% are blue. A witness identified the cab as blue. Witnesses under these circumstances correctly identify cab colors 80% of the time. What is the probability that the cab was green? Kahneman finds that people usually ignore the base rates of the number of cabs and instead favor the witness's accuracy, guessing about 80%.
However, if the first sentence had a sign that a green cab has 85% of accidents, they give more weight to that information because they assume that green cab are more reckless. Thus, the narrative assumption could be statistical information and make people less accurate. Constructing stories about the world is a useful way to make sense of it, but it's become one of the primary ways in which people commit errors in thinking and judgment. Using this example, Kahneman tries to impress on his readers that things like intention, talent, and stupidity only tell part of the story, and that lack of randomness should be just as critical in our understanding of how the world works.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. I am Salina and I'll be sharing the last themes on Thinking Fast and Slow book by Daniel Kahneman, which is choices, losers and gain. So actually what Daniel Kahneman told us about this last themes is Kahneman used prospect theory to demonstrate how our choices actually about money, about goods and gambles are not always based in monetary value, but in value that is based how a person feels about a prospect, how and when they acquire that prospect, and how much time and effort they have already invested in.
Okay, so I will mention parts of the writer's experiments, quotes, examples, and situations based on part 1 in this book. So in part 1, chapter 1, based on the quote from Farrar, Strauss, and Girard's editions of this book, which published in 2011. So an experiment is being illustrated is about the gorilla study, which illustrated two important facts about our minds. We can be blind to obvious, and we are also blind to our blindness. Okay, so this is one of the earliest experiments that the writer introduces, which involves participants watching a short film of two teams, which one wearing white and one wearing black, passing the basketballs. So the viewers are so preoccupied with tasks in which they must count the number of passes that they do not notice a woman wearing a gorilla suit walk through the game. And the gorilla experiment, as the writer suggested, illustrates some of the mistakes that our brains fall victim to. So this example in particular illustrates the limits of system 2. So the system involved with deliberate effort and calculations. The counting number of basketball passes is not something that comes naturally to us, and thus it takes a serious amount of mental effort to do so. So in this scenario, we don't see the gorilla not because system 2 is lazy, but because it is busy and does not have the same amount of mental effort to devote to that task. Okay, so in part 1, also chapter 7, there is a quote mentioned, we often fail to allow for the possibility that evidence that should be critical to our judgment is missing. So basically what we see is all is there. Okay, so in a chapter devoted to demonstrating how our mind automatically jump to conclusions, the writer refers to a study in which people only heard one side of a court case, believed that side of the court case, and were far more confident in their judgment than those who had heard both sides. So this is due to a phenomenon that the writer calls what you see is all there is. Okay, so this means that the evidence that is in front of us is the sole evidence that we use to make judgments without considering the possibility that we might need outside information. So this is both because our mental processes are inherently lazy and because we are overconfident in the information that we already believe and have access to. So this can lead to errors in various kinds of calculations. However, and by using the example of the court case, the writer demonstrates that these biases can have serious consequences in the future. So that's all for my part. Thank you.
Hi, we meet again. So, in this time, I'll be sharing 5 lessons from part 2 Thinking Slow and Fast. So, first lesson in part 2 is lesson number 12. Focusing illusion. Focusing illusion means nothing in life is as important as you think it is. For example, Daniel argues education is an important determinant of income, but it's less important than people think it is. For example, people tend to think that with higher education will get higher salary. So lesson 13 is optimism bias. What is optimism bias? Optimism bias causes a person to believe that they are less risk experiencing a negative event compared to others. For example, you know you can't, but optimism bias says you can. For example, on the day of presentation, you are feeling sick, but you still eager to do so because your optimism bias says you can success and present well on the day of presentation. Let's moving on to the distinction bias, which is the lesson number 15 in thinking fast and slow. So what is distinction bias? Distinction bias is a tendency to perceive two options as more different when evaluating them together as opposed to separately. For example, when televisions are displayed next to each other on the sales floor, the difference in quality between two very similar, high-quality televisions may appear great. A consumer may pay a much higher price for the higher quality television, even though the difference in quality is imperceptible when the televisions are viewed in isolation, because the consumer will likely be watching only one television at a time. The lower cost television will have provided a similar quality viewing at a lower cost. So we've come to the last lesson, which is insight and outcome bias. So what is insight bias? Insight bias is you see an event as having been predictable despite there being little or no chance of predicting it. I'll be sharing the example right just now. Alright, the outcome bias meanwhile means error made in evaluating the quality of a lesson when the outcome of already known. So the example might be, insight bias happen when you asking your friend to go to the beach with you, but she think that it will be rainy in the evening, but she reply it is okay to go. But after 30 minutes later, it's raining in the outside, and she automatically simply reply, see, I told you rather. Meanwhile, outcome bias is when you have a friend who drinks and drive often. The next time he is out about to drink and drive, try telling him that he will not risk it. He will tell you, I have driven safely before. So his choice of driving after drinking is based on previous outcomes. So basically guys, there's a lot of lesson in part 2 of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It will be focusing illusion, optimism bias, distinction bias, insight and outcome bias, halo effect, illusion of validity, risk policies, and framing. But in this video, this time I'll be sharing only the important one, which is focusing illusions, optimism bias that we had learned just now, distinction bias, insight and outcome bias. So I'll hope you can get something from the second part.
I will continue with part 3, chapter 19. Human thinking is limited and its abilities are imperfect. We will forget what we did yesterday, what we ate a few days ago, what color the shirt that we wore a week ago. Basically, it is impossible for us to remember things that have passed except only important things. In general, human beings are easy to forget even when they have just done something or said something. Next, chapter 21. The chapter implies that intuitions of a trained professional yield more accurate results than those based on statistics. The formula is developed not only to facilitate the work done but to obtain as accurate results as possible. Human judgment needs to be replaced by methods in determining the action to be taken. Human experience is subjective and influenced by instinct. Kahneman describes the Ungs test as a prime example of why standardized scoring is more reliable than human intuition. By applying the Ungs score, the maternity ward staff finally has consistent standards for determining which babies have problems. The formula is considered as an important contribution as it helps in reducing infant mortality. Before the existence of the Ungs test, obstetricians use different metrics to determine whether a newborn might be in distress and at risk for brain damage or death. Chapter 24. Experts who acknowledge the full extent of their ignorance may expect to be replaced by more confident competitors who are better able to gain the trust of clients. As Kahneman continues to explore what it means to be an expert and the overconfidence that they often exhibit, he considers a variety of fields in which confidence is rewarded. Even though confidence often comes with an increase in mistakes and biases, people prefer overconfident individuals in fields like financial investment, in television hosting, and in medicine. Overconfident individuals often gain more trust and get to find more success than someone who are lack of confidence. Generally, clients prefer certainty over doubt. Thus, confidence is a must, especially when you are about to gain others' trust.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I will continue for part 4, but I will just focus in chapter 26. Okay, in this chapter, Kahneman discovered the flaws of Bernoulli theories because he noticed that gambles were often spoken in terms of a few pennies. He wondered if it was possible to assume that people evaluate gambles by tiny difference in wealth. Likewise, Tversky quickly realized that another economist had proposed that utilities were attached to changes of wealth rather than states of health. The difference between gain and losses become the primary evidence for prospects theory claim that people's choices about gambles are determined less by the inherent value of money and more by the way their wealth has changed. Kahneman asks readers to consider two problems. First, get $900 for sure or 19% chance to get $1,000. Second, lose $900 for sure or 90% chance to lose $1,000. Most people choose the sure thing in the first problem and the gamble in the second. In the second problem, the sure loss is very evasive and this drives people to take the risk. People become risk-seeking when all options are bad. Bernoulli's theory did not have a way to accommodate this difference. From the problem, Kahneman analyzed that people disliked in the condition of losers and in the condition of two potential losers would rather attempt the chance of maintaining their current wealth, even though it means they might eventually lose some money. But for winning, they would rather have a guarantee of improving their wealth than the potential of not gaining any money at all. Kahneman admits that there are benefits in the utility theory, especially in economic texts. The basic concepts of economics are not easy and are also grounded in rationality. Introducing psychology makes those concepts even more complicated.
Oh hi! Finally, we came to the end of this sharing. So what you need to remember is there's two systems in our brain according to the Daniel Kahneman, which is system 1 regards as fast thinking, system 2 is slow thinking. So what is the characteristic of system 1 and system 2? System 1 regard as fast thinking, way of thinking. It is automatic and effortless, while system 2, which is slow thinking, it is effortful, conscious, control mental process, and rational thinking. So I do hope with this kind of sharing it will benefit all of us to knowing what is system 1, what is system 2 in our daily life, and to think, for me, regardless how much we use system 1 and system 2, is depends on ourselves, and do not judge people of which system they are taking. And I do hope this kind of sharing will benefit all of us. I think that's all from us. Thank you for watching.